This is Theory of Change. I'm Matthew Sheffield. Thanks for joining me for another episode. Before we get to today's program, I just wanted to mention that Theory of Change is part of the Flux Media Network, so go to flux.community for more podcasts and articles about politics, religion, media, and society, and how they all intersect and affect each other. And if you want to get the archives of this program, just go to theoryofchange.show, where you can get the full video, audio, and transcript. It is in the Flux website, and we are on Substack and Patreon. If you are able to subscribe that way, you can do that. And of course, I encourage everybody to subscribe on your favorite podcast platforms as well. And if you're watching on YouTube, please do click the like and subscribe button. Thank you very much. All right, so with that out of the way, let's get into today's program. Kamala Harris's loss to Donald Trump came as a huge surprise to many Democratic Party loyalists, especially since Republicans had a number of serious defeats in elections in 2018 and in 2022. And further, abortion rights activists were able to successfully protect abortion access in every single state where it was on the ballot after the Republican Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. So what happened? The short answer for why this happened is that Democrats do not have a political ecosystem the way that Republicans do. And we've talked on this program at length in several episodes about how Democrats do not have a left-wing media to the degree that Republicans do. But a political ecosystem is more than just a media advocacy system. It's also about how things work at the local level as well. And in that regard, the Republican Party is very superior to Democrats in many ways. There are multiple institutions, two prominent ones, that are continually driving people to vote for Republicans and explaining to them why they should do so. And that is talk radio and also right-wing Christian churches. These two institutions are daily popularizing and explaining the message of Republicans to Americans who don't follow politics closely and may not fully understand all the ins and outs and not care a lot about the policies. But what they do care about is that there are people who they believe are looking out for them and have the same thoughts as them, and they're in their community. They can go to their supermarket and they can see their talk radio host, or they can go to their church services or synagogue services and meet people who will explain to them how Donald Trump is God's servant. Within the Democratic Party, however, these types of local political institutions are kind of looked down upon in a number of ways. But that isn't how things used to be. In fact, unions were the centerpiece in many ways for the Democratic Party, and the way that people were brought into it and understood why they should vote for Democrats, because they were trying to protect the gains that they had achieved and to obtain new ones in the future. And one person who understands how all of this worked in days of yore is our guest on today's episode. His name is Erik Loomis, and he's a professor of history at the University of Rhode Island, where he focuses on labor issues. He's written a number of different books, and he's also a blogger at the website Lawyers, Guns, and Money. And joining me now is Erik Loomis. Welcome to the show.
Oh, I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so you have been writing a lot on the blog, the shared blog that you post on called Lawyers, Guns, and Money, about, not just you, but you and your co-bloggers, many of them have been, tackling this idea of there's something wrong with Democrats. Even before the election, you guys were have been edging around this point for a while, it seems like.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that if you look at the election, right? I mean, in a lot of ways, and I should say up front, I mean, I think that there are so many election hot takes out there, and I think a lot of them are flawed. I mean, I think we do have to put everything into a kind of global context about governing parties and the post-pandemic inflation generally doing quite poorly in elections, and that's all very important. And I think we have to keep that as part of our focus, and not just engage in a kind of contextless blame game. But I also think that we're facing an opponent here that's not like an opponent that we faced with even Reagan, right? Even George W. Bush, who were genuinely terrible people and terrible presidents. But this particular iteration of the Republican Party is effectively a fascist party, and it's very important to be thinking about broader ways to resist that. And the Democratic Party's model of anything has not really adjusted itself in 15 to 20 years, right? But what does the Democratic campaign look like today, right? It's a post Citizens United endless fundraising effort, right? And that's really all it is, right? You get inundated with endless emails and texts, and maybe suggestions to engage in get out the vote campaign or something of this nature, and that's really kind of it, right? And eventually you start tuning this out because it gets annoying to get this many text messages and this many emails. But there's a certain effectiveness in it. I mean, Kamala Harris had an ungodly amount of money, but as we've seen over the last, it's really several cycles, including congressional Senate campaigns, you can have an endless amount of money and you run out of ways to spend it, and it doesn't actually help you win. The campaign to defeat Susan Collins in Maine, in 2020 was a perfect example of this, right? And so I think Democrats have to figure out new ways to conduct campaigns and new ways to think of themselves as Democrats in order to engage a kind of broader populace who is very unhappy about the way things are going and clearly is not responding to the kinds of campaigns the Democrats put together.
They're trying to, and I forget who said this, but I like the idea, is that they're trying to activate people rather than engage with them.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And there's a room for activation. I mean, that's part of that can be part of a campaign, but that can't be all of the campaign. And so often that's become all of the campaign is a short-term activation of people. And then it's like, okay, now we win. It's all good. Go back to your regular lives. And nothing really happens until the next campaign.
Yeah. Well, and it comes off as very insincere to people because, they hear that, because this message, I mean, I don't know, to some degree, is it fair to say that the Democratic Party has been crying wolf about the Republicans being fascist? Because they were saying things like Mitt Romney is trying to create fascists. I heard people say things like that, or that George W. Bush wanted to be Hitler. And Donald Trump, as you said, is a completely different candidate than these people, and so to some degree, I think people might be put off by that. But also just the fact that there's this tremendous urgency that exists for 3 months of the year, and then there's no urgency at any other time.
Well, I mean, I think that regardless of the accuracy of such depictions, which were obviously less accurate under Romney and Bush than they are under Trump and Vance and these sorts of people. Regular voters, everyday folks, don't respond to this. And that's the bigger issue, right? They don't respond to this. They tune it out. And I think that, you saw this in with the Harris campaign's choice to go all in on people like Liz Cheney, which I wouldn't have had such a problem with if it was going to move any voters at all, right? But it moved nobody, right? Like nobody cared. Yeah. And so regardless, it's ineffective. And then to me, that's the bigger issue. It's just totally ineffective.
Well, it is. And it's ineffective because, basically it was premised on the idea that, well, we can get some, people who don't like either candidate to vote for Kamala Harris. But the problem is they also hadn't created a gigantic media machine to, 24/7 push their case. And so basically now, as I said in an essay last month, that, the election was decided by people who didn't like both candidates. And it was really, but it came down to the people disliked Harris more. That was it. It was evenly divided between the people who liked each one, and then there were 2% of people in the exit polls who said they liked both of them. I want to hear from those people. But ultimately they didn't create the infrastructure to run a negative partisanship campaign. It seems like.
I think that's. I mean, you were right in that essay. I think that You don't have a media infrastructure at all, and I mean, in the kind of like immediate post election moment, people are like, oh, we need to create the Democratic Joe Rogan. And it's like, well, it doesn't, I mean, yes, in a sense, but that doesn't quite get it. Like, the people saying that don't understand what Joe Rogan does or what his history or any of this sort of thing. I think that the broader takeaway there is kind of going back to what you said, is that the Democrats don't have an ecosystem at all, right? There's just no ecosystem. It's all about activating voters at a very particular time, and that's very effective for a base kind of vote, but it's not very effective for lower information voters. It's not very effective for people who have pretty short-term memories about things, people who don't pay attention to what Donald Trump is saying or doing, don't pay attention to who he's naming Kash Patel to the FBI, the head of the FBI. They don't care about that stuff. Yeah. They don't care, and it's that kind of stuff is very ineffective. You need a kind of a media network that allows your candidates and your ideas to reach into a different kind of voter, right? And MSNBC simply does not do that, right? They are, I mean, I'm mixed on various MSNBC shows, and regardless of its future, it's totally ineffective at touching those kind of voters too.
And it's only one channel, whereas Fox, there are 7 alternatives to Fox that are, all of them are even more further right. But even aside from media, though, like infrastructure means an ecosystem mean more than just that. So, and that was something that you had written recently about, that there were these, local organizations that used to be very common and were very, driving people into the Democratic Party and understanding sort of the shared theory of the case,
right,
for voting, being on the left.
Right.
And can you talk about that?
Look, if you look at the 1930s, for instance, and the aftermath of that going through the 60s and 70s, so a long period of time, and I understand the nation is different today and people have different activities that they do, but what it meant to be a Democrat was something that was actually central to your entire life. I mean, the first thing there was in large parts of the country was the Union Hall, right? And, the reality is part of what we're dealing with right now is the wages of an entire generation of Democrats that turn their back on the labor movement. And, here I'm not talking about Joe Biden, who was older and, did what he could and was very good for unions with the limited power they actually had to create policy that could get through courts and such things. But here we're talking about not only, but very much talking about Jimmy Carter, very much talking about Bill Clinton, to an extent talking about Barack Obama, but even generations of a whole generation of Democrats that did not actually get to the White House. Like Michael Dukakis was horrible on unions, right? Michael Dukakis actually lost his first re-election campaign to governor of Massachusetts because he had angered the union so much, right? Gary Hart is extraordinarily anti-union. Jerry Brown is incredibly anti-union. So you had a whole generation of Democrats coming up in the 70s and 80s at the same time that these manufacturing jobs are disappearing. They're actually fine with basically gutting the labor movement. And what that did was to undermine the tight connections between large swaths of the American working class, the labor movement, and the Democratic Party, the kind of thing that had been tied in by people like Walter Reuther, by people like Sidney Hillman, but also by politicians, but people like, FDR, of course, but even a Harry Truman, who was not explosively pro-union or anything, but was, understood coalitional politics. So that's just totally gone. But you also have the other kinds of social organizations that were big through much of the 20th century that tied people together, and they're also gone. I mean, you have these like Americans, and I'm hardly the first person to make this point. I mean, the sociologist Robert Putnam famously wrote about this in his 2000 book, Bowling Alone. But Americans are incredibly atomized, and we don't get together to talk about things, talk about politics, talk about life. We're in our tiny little communities, and these communities don't really meet. And so you have what that ends up leading to is, in part, this incredibly fractured kind of media environment that Democrats have not understood and have not been able to make any connections with, while also just really having no ideas about how to engage voters or just engage even base Democrats on a day-to-day, month-to-month kind of basis. And, I think we suffer for that, right? We suffer for not having something that we can actually go out and do on a daily or monthly basis, other than like register people to vote and the kind of same old. But actually building community and pride as a Democrat, this really is totally gone in much of this country now.
It is. And it's, and it's not just about, community, although that's obviously very important, but it's also about understanding why we're doing this. Like the sense of a collective story. And I think it's illustrative to look at, because, so as you said, the unions were kind of sort of the local roots for the Democratic Party, democratic activism historically. But that wasn't true in Black American communities. And where that was, what it was for them was the Black church. That was the community epicenter. And it's notable that when you look at Black voter demographics, in every single poll that's out there, it's always the younger ones who are less identified with the Democratic Party, and that's because they don't go to church. They're less likely to go to church, and so that held true in this past election that we had, where the older Black voters were extremely pro-democratic, and Black women were one of the few demographic groups that voted more for the Democrats versus in 2020 at a higher percentage. And it was because they have, there are places to give them a shared story and understand this is the point of what we're doing. This isn't just, an idle exercise. This isn't just fun and games or just something to do. It actually is meaningful what we're doing here, and you have a place in it. We don't have that.
That's such an important point. That's a very, very important point. And the decline of the white liberal or the white mainline Protestant church has been a very, very big part of this, right? Because that was another place in which people got together. I mean, just let me tell you a personal story. I mean, so I'm from the town of Springfield, Oregon, and in 1992. A far-right group called the Oregon Citizens Alliance targeted my town to pass an anti-gay hate ordinance, and it passed in that town. And it went on, that group went on to attempt to pass several statewide ordinances in Oregon and were defeated. And it was a very traumatic thing. I was a senior in high school, so it was like my friends were going out and like, we hate gays, and I was like, what are you talking about? Like, who cares? I just didn't really get it, right? And I wasn't even particularly political. But the reason I tell this story is that we came out of a Lutheran family, and we're not overtly liberal or anything like that on a general basis. But the pastor of the church was like very, very active in pushing back against these evangelicals who were pushing this anti-gay hate, right? And this was the kind of leadership that you got from mainline Protestant churches and members of those churches who, in those spaces, could potentially have uncomfortable conversations about social change, right? Or, rally around candidates, rally around a vision of economics that was more shared rather than this, new Gilded Age plutocracy that we see that the evangelical churches push. That's another area in which it's totally got the Lutherans, the Episcopalians, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, the Congregationalists. Their numbers have just totally cratered. And we've lost that space as well. And you are now beginning to see that in the Black community as well. This nation is more atheist or agnostic than it's ever been in its history. And while some people might think that could lead to more progressive politics, it in fact has the opposite impact.
So for communities that had benefited from government action, they had a place to understand how that happened. Like the core problem of governance is that you don't want to think about it. People, the whole point of having a government is that it works and you don't have to worry about it. And the Republican Party, because of this, Ayn Rand, market fundamentalism and religious fundamentalism, declared war on modernity and on functioning government, beginning with Barry Goldwater. And Ronald Reagan, made that very explicit. And so the goal was to make government as bad for everyone else as they saw it, as this noxious, horrible influence on society. And so they've been, running around constantly tearing everything down, and it worked. We're at this position now where we have fewer federal employees as a percentage of the GDP, than in decades. And then Elon Musk is talking about he's going to cut 75% of them, which would do almost nothing in terms of the federal budget. But this is their ideology. And these are complicated things to understand if you don't really pay attention to politics. As a person, it's not your hobby or it's not your job, whatever it is. It's if you're not that, and because we're a minority, I think that's something that people who have progressive or democratic commitments always forget, is that most people don't care or understand, and they're not going to. So you have to do something about that. You have to play with that in mind.
I mean, that's right. I mean, I think, I write for this blog, Lawyers, Guns, and Money, and it has a lot of commenters, and they tend to be like very much, pretty well-educated, white, kind of base Democrat types. And they, like we all do, right, exist in these kind of tiny self-reinforcing communities. And they were so determined that Harris was going to win, so determined that abortion was going to, take the woman over the top, that women were going to, women were going to lead for a democratic victory. And of course, Trump won white women for the third election in a row. And so it's very easy for people who are deeply engaged in this stuff to convince themselves of that other people are too. And they're simply not. And, if you go back to the 30s through the 70s, I mean, one of the things that you saw in that time was not so much a deep understanding of policy, right? Like the unions would certainly provide some of that. And there were also things like Democratic clubs, which I actually think would be great. Like, why don't Democrats start Democratic bars, right? An actual bar that was for Democrats explicitly. And like other people could come in, but it's a Democratic space. And like, there's good beer or whatever. And, again, these kind of like, what would a modern social function be that could replicate some of these club type things that would help with this stuff? But the point is it's not as if people understood like the creation of HUD or something under, whenever that was, Kennedy or Johnson or whatever it was, but it was the understanding that there was a person in the White House who was going to work for you, right? And so everyday people would have, pictures of FDR on their wall, like next to the Jesus picture. Or, even, certainly for Catholics of Kennedy. And like, it meant something more than just a politician being elected. It was somebody who you ultimately believed was looking out for your interests. And that alone, and I think that developed through those kind of institutions and that shared understanding that you might not, understand what's going on in Washington per se. And, everybody always thinks that, the bozos in Washington are doing X, Y, and Z and whatever. But that person was looking out for you, and that person was connected to a Democratic Party that you were pretty likely to vote for, at least most of the time. And that was strong enough in its policy positions that even when you might vote for a Republican, like in the Eisenhower era as an example, or even to an extent the Nixon era, what you were actually voting for was somebody who was going to hold up most of that state that you might not understand, but you knew was going to work for you because the political cost of doing so was going to be too toxic. And Reagan is ultimately the moment in which that transforms. And a lot of that has to do with civil rights and race. And, we can get into that if we want to, but that we've lost that ability. And it's really critical to gain that back, because sending a bunch of text messages a month before the election about, this candidate is 1 point behind this other candidate, give, $100 is clearly not working.
Yeah, no, it isn't. Well, so I mean, you're a labor historian, but let's maybe circle back to that aspect of this. So, a lot of people have remarked how labor unions have declined in this country. Tell my audience why you think that happened. I mean, obviously there's a lot of reasons for that. And
Yeah.
were people in the labor union leadership did they really try to do anything about this while it was happening? I don't know if they did that much. Did they?
Well, it's complicated. I mean, the short version of the decline of the labor movement is a combination of about four factors, right? One is that a lot of the jobs simply disappeared, right? That they went to Mexico, they went to Asia, and to China, part of globalization, which is something that was pushed by both political parties. The second was automation. So you have this like peak in the labor movement in the 50s, but even before the jobs really started disappearing in the mid 60s, automation and technological change was taking thousands and thousands and thousands of jobs in industries every single year. And so you had that kind of decline. Third, certainly, was the end of the organizing era, right? The labor movement itself dropped the ball. It effectively stopped organizing after the leftists were thrown out of the movement in the late 1940s, early 1950s. You had a movement that was pretty fat and happy, a movement that believed it had a permanent partnership with the Democratic Party and a lot of influence within the Republican Party. And when that was proven to be untrue, it really did not have the ability, wherewithal, or even the skills and energy at that point to really do very much about it. There's other critiques I can make of the labor movement as well. I think those three are the biggest things, but then also a kind of, again, a political transformation in this country that really, comes out of the 1960s that is a bigger, more of an existential crisis, I think, than we give it credit for, which is the rise of this very extreme atomized individualism that was, yes, the Randianism of the far right is a big part of that, but the counterculture absolutely 100% embraced that as well, right? That the union became part of the man in the 60s and was part of the problem. And so, I as an individual am going to withdraw from society. I'm going to go out on my own. I'm going to, do what, join a commune for a while or whatever I'm going to do. But it became, even on the left among Democrats, this extremely individualistic ideas about politics. And that's still tremendously influential today. And that is across the political spectrum, from the far left to the far right. We conceptualize ourselves as incredibly empowered individuals, and parties need to appeal to me and my personal beliefs, as opposed to me needing to make broader connections with others around a complexity of issues that may or may not completely reflect my politics, but that engage in an idea of solidarity. And solidarity is transformed from we help each other to you need to help me around my issue without any, say, obligation from me going back to you on your issue. And that's really the opposite of what the development of solidarity looked like out of the labor movement of the late 19th century.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because in the Republican Party, they developed an inverse of this concept, which they called fusionism, which was this idea that, if you were somebody who was interested in Christian supremacism, or you were interested in, aggressive foreign policy, or you were interested in business, giving the oligarchs whatever they want, you needed to understand that you have to support the candidates with these other two issues. And you may not like them, but you need to keep your mouth shut and not criticize them. At the very least, that's what you have to do. And that powered the Republican Party through Ronald Reagan. Like, that was the difference maker between the complete disaster of Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan's 1980 win. Was that they had that sense, and they really did explain this. Like, if you talk to anyone who is or was a Republican who's, let's say, 50 and older today, they all have this knowledge of the three legs of the Republican stool. They all say it. You tune into talk radio, all the hosts, they all say it. All the callers say it if they're old enough. This is this shared story that they have, and now, they've updated it post Cold War to be, more about, well, we're against the deep state. That's what we're against, and that's now the shared narrative for the right. And it's, to what you said, this idea of ignorant anarchism, which in many ways is, calls itself leftist, but in operations actually ends up becoming right wing, and Bobby Kennedy is probably the best case example of that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think you're absolutely right about the Republican Party. Whereas Democrats will say, and it's especially true on the left, that candidate has to earn my vote. Well, why? Right? What is your obligation to the rest of the country? It's not a question and people really don't like to have to be asked that question. That leads to a lot of resentment I found. And it really goes back to a kind of lost idea of what solidarity really means. Like, yes, you know what every candidate is? The lesser of two evils, or perhaps the greater of two evils in given cases. That's the way the world works. Like, I'm sorry, that's the actual reality of
that's always how it's
in a coalitional politics. That's the reality of how things are always going to be. And the just like stubborn unwillingness of people on the left who call themselves leftist to just shrug their shoulders about that fact, go out and do the right thing, and understand that if you win, you have a stake in that broader coalition. And if you lose, you have nothing but your own self-regard. And to make that choice about having some power in a coalition, it's a real problem on the left. And I think that, look, was I, on a personal level, was I happy to be voting for Hillary Clinton in 2016? No, I was not. Right? I hated Bill Clinton. Hillary is no better, but you do what you have to do because of this is the nation which we have. It may not be the nation we want to have, but it's the one we got. And we see, and we saw some of the some of the consequences of that, and yet there's a real unwillingness to learn. So it's very difficult to come up with collective solutions when people talk a game about collectivism, but in fact act as incredibly empowered individualists.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and to circle back to another issue that you mentioned earlier, there was this very widespread hope that the end of Roe versus Wade was going to activate millions of American women. And what people missed and didn't understand is that basically, because Democrats had become the party of the educated class, those are the people who vote in off-year elections more. And that was the reason why Republicans got hurt so badly in 2018 and in 2022. It was because the high propensity voters, those are, like when people, we've talked on this show and you've written about, the people who pay attention to the news the most, they vote for Democrats now. And the ones who don't pay attention at all, they vote for Republicans. So that's what happened with the midterm elections. And I remember saying this a couple of times, and people got very offended that I would dare to suggest that was really what was going on. Because, when you, and then when you look at the numbers, it was true that for Gen Z women, who are directly impacted by these horrible laws that Republicans are pushing through in their states and are killing, young women. That's predominantly who's being, worst impacted by these things. They did have made a very sharp turn to become much more democratic than any other generation. But for Gen X women and women out, older than that, there is this natural human myopia to think, well, if it doesn't impact me personally, then I don't care about it. It doesn't matter.
Right.
And so a lot of women, who are, for whatever reason, not having children at that stage in their life, that was, they thought, well, hey, if Trump, he turned it over to the states, so we can just vote for him anyway. It's safe to vote for him. And even if we had a bad law, it wouldn't affect me. So who cares?
And look, we've seen this for years and years with the minimum wage, where you have voters on ballot measures overwhelmingly support rise to the minimum wage, and then we'll vote in Republicans in places like South Dakota, Nebraska, who are outright opposed to even the sheer existence of the minimum wage. And we're like, we'll vote at the state legislative level to overturn that ballot measure, but they just don't make those connections. Yeah. And I think that I've seen, a lot of the people who comment on the site is a kind of wake up after November 6th to just what this nation is and who these voters are. But the response is these people are morons and screw them. Like, they deserve what they get. I'm out. These people are too dumb for me to deal with. And, I guess I understand a kind of immediate post-election outrage, but boy, that's not going to be very helpful in trying to save people's lives, keep unions legal, keep abortion legal, or anything else that these, liberals in this case, claim to believe in, right? I mean, you simply have to find ways to connect with these voters. And again, what the Democratic Party has done and what that entire kind of infrastructure of Democratic leadership has pushed forward over these last several elections, again, it's just not working, right? And so we have to figure out ways to engage those voters in some kind of way. I mean, even if we fail to do so, I'm not going to sit here and claim I have all the right ideas, because I don't know. I do know that what we have right now is not working, and we need to New Deal style, in a sense, right? Where in the early New Deal, FDR didn't know if any of these programs were going to work, but a lot of them didn't. Right. And he would just like, okay, well, we'll try something else. That's kind of what we need to be thinking about in terms of what it means to be a Democrat in 2025.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and there also is this very common use of the phrase fuck around and find out now, where they think that the voters they're going to learn that Republicans are bad based on bad policies. And you know what? I don't think they're going to, because Republicans basically, their entire goal is to break the government. So in a sense, making government not work, making it non-functional, that is what they voted for. And the people who voted for Trump, they think the system is horrible. Like, they want to just, so like, They don't want to fuck around and find out. They want to fuck it off. They want to blow it up. And they have this, it is a very naive nihilism. But that's basically what the Republican Party has done, is that they've taken their own, religious nihilism, because now it's not possible. And I say this as a former Mormon fundamentalist, that, when I was a Mormon fundamentalist, I truly did believe that Native Americans were ancient Jews. I really believed that, even though I knew that I couldn't prove that. I knew I couldn't prove it, and it made me angry at society because they rejected what I believed was the truth. And so, Republicans have been, the hardcore base activist. That's what they've been doing, is to try to weaponize and instill nihilism in everyone else, and it's working. Yeah. To a large degree.
Well, I think what Democrats have to do is to quit pretending like the system is working, right? And to quit defending the system, and instead simply accept what voters are telling them, that to them the system is not working, and then figure out ways to engage them in drastic change. I mean, a moment I thought was very interesting after the election is when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez actually reached out to voters in her district, which went way toward Trump. I mean, one of the most biggest swings toward Republicans in the entire country was that district. And she's like, who are the AOC Trump voters, right? And they were pretty open about it, right? Both AOC and Trump meant change, meant somebody who stood up to the system, stood up to the bullshit, and said it was bullshit, and that's who I want. And they're not thinking very much deeper than that. Well, there's an opportunity there. Right? There's an opportunity there for Democrats to move away from defending a system that is a system, as a nation dominated by billionaires, a nation in which, it feels like, regardless of whether the Republicans are responsible for this or not, and of course they are, the government's not working for them. There's an opportunity to create a kind of politics out of that is an Ocasio-Cortez type of politics, where you really do say this system is totally broken and we are going to revolutionize or remake the system, and to channel that anger and channel that energy in a more productive way than Donald Trump's like, let's kill all the trans people or whatever.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and that, I mean, that is essentially what he's saying to people is, everything is horrible. So let's just tear it down and let my billionaire buddies privatize everything. And the average voter, they didn't pay attention to that latter part because Trump didn't actually say that. But that is what he's going to do. And there's I mean, it's just incredibly clear in that regard. And there is a certain irony in the fact that you're a university professor and we're talking about this also, but like, the educational system for America. So like Joe Biden, he took a step in acknowledging that a lot of people were basically conned into paying for college degrees that got them nothing. And now they just nothing but debt. And they're carrying it around like a millstone for the rest of their life, or a ball and chain. But he didn't say what they were feeling. He just said, well, I'm going to try to help you with this debt. And he didn't say why. And like I think, that is the core problem of the Biden administration, is that, that they had the right ideas on a lot of policies, Lena Khan and, a lot of the FTC stuff, and some great regulations out of the FCC and, other regulatory bodies, and, prescription drug negotiating authority. And I mean, they let Joe Manchin and the Senate parliamentarian boss them around on other stuff, but overall he made a lot of the right policy choices, but he never explained to the public, this is why we're doing it. And I'm doing it for you.
If the public tells you that eggs are too expensive, then they're too expensive, right? It doesn't matter why. It doesn't matter. You as a political leader have to be able to take that anger and articulate that in a way that makes you and your party and your policies look like the only solution. And not just, I mean, Biden, yes, absolutely, but Harris is really no better. There's a real failure at doing that, at acknowledging the anger, saying, I too am angry, and taking actions that show that that you respect that anger and you're going to do something about it. And people respond to that, to their anger being validated. I mean, if there's one thing that Donald Trump demonstrates, is that people respond to their anger being validated. And Donald Trump does a hell of a job of doing that. I believe Donald Trump is an incredibly stupid human being, but he has this innate ability to channel people's anger and hatred. And Democrats actually have to do that too, right? If you can't say, yes, this higher education system is a disaster and it's horrible that you have this debt, and we're gonna do whatever we can to make sure that future generations don't have that, or that the price of eggs is outrageous, or that healthcare systems are incredibly toxic and are killing people. I mean, we're recording this the day after the killing of that United Healthcare CEO, and it's like the kind of visceral response to that has created among people who just generally loathe the American healthcare system. Why are Democrats not taking advantage of that hatred? And like, I know that base liberals hate the idea. I shouldn't even use the word hate here. They disdain the idea of that kind of emotionalist politics. But I don't really see how you fight the growth of American fascism without recognizing that the majority of this country thinks this nation is pretty broken, and have that and require an emotionalist response in order to gain their support and their votes.
Yeah, absolutely. You need to understand that, while it is, I mean, basically the system is now effectively rigged against people who don't have a postgraduate degree. That's essentially what it is. Like, you can get a job, but it's going to be $40,000 a year, and that's it. You won't have any choice. You can't afford to live in some of the more expensive areas of the country, in part because they don't have, they won't be able to do housing, and that's another kind of residual. The NIMBY coalition is this weird bipartisan happening where you've got older Democrats who use fake environmental objections when really they have the same concerns of, well, I don't want these poor people moving into my neighborhood.
Well, I mean, the housing issue.
I don't want the wrong kind of people.
Right. I mean, the housing issue and the NIMBYism is a perfect example of this extreme individualism that I talk about, right? It's people who moved to San Francisco in 1968, bought a house in the mid 70s, and were still in the house and are determined that nothing's ever going to change ever, 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 and they don't really care what the consequences of that are because their house is worth some ungodly amount of money, and that's all that matters to them. I mean, so now everybody hates California is moving away. And they're moving to Texas in part because of resentments around that. Because you could build cheaply in Texas.
Yeah. Yeah, and people have the right to be angry about it.
They do.
That's and the terrible irony of these NIMBY policies is that they have cost the Democrats the House of Representatives because of population loss in blue areas, because people can't afford to live there and they want to.
California is projected to lose, I believe, 4 seats in the 2030 census. Yeah. I mean, that's incredible. All of them are going to go to Texas and Florida.
Yeah. And as a former Republican, political activist and media consultant, it's always stunning to me how conservative that Democrats are in how they do things, and how Democrats are far more capitalistic than Republicans are. Republicans are communalists. They are constantly lifting people up. So in the Fox News, they will reach down to the most anonymous Twitter poster that they can find and put them on their show. Whereas, if you're the host of a popular left-wing podcast or something, they don't give a shit who you are. And, or you're a popular left-wing writer, they're only going to promote people who are their friends. And this is not a movement mentality. And that's why the right is having these wins, because they understand that you have that solidarity isn't just about the issues; it's about how you treat each other.
And I think frankly, I think that there's a lot of Democratic leadership types are actually pretty fine with Republican economic policies, right? They want lower taxes too. It doesn't actually hurt them that much that Donald Trump's president. And I think that this is part of the issue. I mean, it's a bunch of very wealthy Beltway people who control the Democratic Party, and it's a very, it's very insular. I mean, this sort of attempts by certain members of it within the party, let's resurrect Rahm Emanuel. It's what are we doing here? How is that? What on earth response is that going to be to Donald Trump to resurrect the career of Rahm Emanuel and put it back in charge of the Democratic Party? It's amazing. But I think a lot of it has to do with if there's one group in this country that actually recognizes its class interests, it's the rich, and that includes rich Democrats.
It does, yeah. And there was, essentially, neoliberalism is what has sometimes been referred to as high tax liberalism. That's all it is. It's fine with deregulation. It's fine with centralization of power. It's fine with redistribution of wealth to the upper class. But with just, a little bit more taxes off the top. Yeah. That's it. Yeah. Everything else is the same.
Right. It's and a kind of a social liberalism that goes very well with that, right? A very, maybe a robust support of, say, gay rights or abortion rights. But none of that threatens the class interests of the people, who are benefiting from these neoliberal policies. And I think that in no small part of what we're dealing with right now is basically the impact of the neoliberal emptying out of the American working class, right? The Democratic Party under Carter and Clinton and Obama explicitly push forward policies that undermine the American working class. So why would American workers support these people who, the Republicans might not do anything for them economically either, but at least they channel their angers and fears about other things, right? What did Barack Obama do for the United Auto Workers, right? He forced them to take a horrible deal when he preserved the, when he bailed out the auto industry in 2009. Right? Like, why would, it's very, very hard to get UAW members to be like big time supporters of Democrats because they remember what Barack Obama did for them. And, it's true of Clinton, it's true of Carter. I mean, this is, we have to rebuild a lot that these Democrats tore down, as well as Republicans tearing it down too. But we expect the Republicans to do this. We shouldn't expect it from our own party.
Yeah. Well, and here's the other perverse irony is that, they broke the connection between economic and social justice because those two things actually require each other to be protected. And this is something that a lot of them who want these more conservative economic policies, that they tell people, well, we can't have gay rights if we don't, give the Republicans what they want on taxes. But that's not true, actually. And what we're seeing with the hollowing out of the class, sort of ethic in the Democratic Party is it's made the social gains vulnerable because now Republicans are talking about repealing same-sex marriage. Now we're seeing them, literally banning the teaching of about institutional racism or the history of race, or talking about gender discrimination and like all of these things that the Clinton types, the Emanuel types, that they stuck their necks out to some degree. I mean, Joe Biden certainly famously did support same-sex marriage before any other major Democratic politician did, but all of these gains, they don't mean anything because without that shared sense of everyone should have a shot, then no one gets a shot except for the people with the money.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important for people to understand you can't protect people and you can't push forward people's rights if you can't win an election. You have to be able to win. You have to figure out what it takes to win those elections and to build that kind of broad-based coalition that can fight against what Republicans are offering. If you can't do that, then all your policy stuff around trans rights and civil rights and gender issues, none of it's going to win. Like, you're going to lose all of it. And that's what we're seeing right now, right? Look, the white working class has always been vulnerable to racism. This goes back to the 19th century. It's a deep problem with American life. And it's a reason why America did not have the kind of radical labor that you saw in much of Europe, right? Because it was divided by race. It's always been an issue. But what was the one organization that could temper some of that? What's the one organization that existed in the United States that could convince whites, you actually do not have these racial interests. You need to unite across race around class interests. And that was the labor union movement, right? So white working class Americans have always had a vulnerability to racism. This has been an issue going really back to the Irish in the 1820s and 30s, who began to embrace whiteness as a way to break into the American economy and American life. So this has always been an issue, and it's part of the reason why Americans have, people often wonder, especially the left, why does the U.S. not have the kind of radical working class that has existed in Europe? And this is a big part of the reason why. But the point is, even given that, there's one institution in American history that's been able to take that anger or that racism that often exists in the white working class and tell their members, look, this is wrong, this is bad, and you're hurting yourself. You need to unite around the issue of class and vote for the party that's going to push for the benefit of all workers. And that has been somewhat effective, right? The difference between, and it still is today, right? Union members still vote for Democrats today at very consistent levels, right? Kamala Harris won union members. The difference is that today 10% of American workers are union, whereas half a century or more ago it was 35 or even 40% of American workers, and that's millions of voters right there.
Yeah, it is, and and I think that's a very important point because Republicans have been, at great pains to try to portray themselves as a working class party. They're just constantly flooding the internet with that type of messaging. And, it's not true based on the policies that they implement. And, you look at who the people that are the supposed tribunes of the working class. It's Donald Trump, who's a billionaire, whose greatest policy achievement was a tax cut for billionaires. It's Josh Hawley, who is a wholly owned subsidiary of Charles Koch. And, all these fake populist people out there who implement policies that are, nothing any more different, any really different from the people that were there before.
Well, I think that when you lose the ability, and Democrats have done this, when you even Biden, again, a very pro-union president in his heart, when you lose the ability to channel economic anger and to talk the language of economic anger, what you do is you open the door to cultural anger, and Republicans are very good at cultural anger, right? Take all the WWE stuff or the UFC stuff that has been, is this like extremely masculine kind of cultures that may not really be working class, but certainly plays working class and really make them their own. Democrats, again, have totally lost the ability to grab onto any kind of actual working class cultural identity and make it their own. Right? Where is the working class cultural identity in this country that is explicitly connected to some form of liberalism? Other than the union itself, it doesn't exist. Donald Trump is a master of this.
The other thing is that I think Democratic operatives, they had the assumption that Donald Trump was a weak candidate. But in fact, Donald Trump is a very strong Republican candidate, probably the strongest. Well, objectively, he is the strongest Republican that they've had since Ronald Reagan. He got the job done for them, and in a way that George W. Bush even could not do, even though he won re-election. He has real loyalty to himself and his brand. And Democrats, they have consistently underestimated. Look, the reality is Donald Trump is not a particularly intelligent person. He his brain is clearly in cognitive decline. But nonetheless, he has that salesman approach, and he listens to the customer, maybe not to give them what they want, but at least to tell them what they want and to tell them that he's listening.
Yeah, that's the lesson Democrats need to take here, right? Having a candidate who can articulate a policy is not going to win. Nobody cares. Having a candidate that can articulate your hopes, your dreams, your fears, or your hatreds, that's a win. That's a much more winning approach, right? And they better learn that, right? Some, I don't know, like the conditions in 2028 are likely to be different, right? So maybe a Josh Shapiro, Gretchen Whitmer, some of these people on what is a fairly deep Democratic bench could win. But if they are going up against somebody, presumably not Donald Trump, but who can continue to channel the kind of Trumpian resentment, there's a very good chance that while we may think that these people are clowns, that they are in fact incredibly strong candidates because the everyday low information voter sees them as articulating their, again, hopes, dreams, fears, and or hatreds. And if Democrats don't learn that, then it's going to be very difficult for them to tap into what is a very clear desire for a populist politics in this country. And populism can go either way, right? Populism can be incredibly reactionary, as in Trumpian populism, or it can be channeled for progressive aims, as it was in the 1930s. Democrats have to figure out how to manage that. And if they don't, then people that we might think are idiots and clowns, like anybody who's been appointed into the Trump administration, like one of them is probably going to be the candidate in 2028, whether it's a Vance or a DeSantis or Laura Trump, or Dana White, the head of UFC. Like, he'd be a perfect Republican candidate. Democrats better figure this out.
Yeah, absolutely. And the cultural politics, it works because people, it's easy to make a scapegoat. And so like transgender Americans have been, people have been trying to claim that, oh, well, Trump won the election because of, fear about transgender people. And that's probably not true. But it is true that those fears, really were helpful to him. But so there was a poll that was done by YouGov a couple of years ago that asked people, well, so what percentage of Americans do you think are, and various minority groups? And they asked people, so what percentage of Americans are gay or lesbian? And people said 30% of Americans were gay or lesbian. And they said that 30% of Americans live in New York City, and 30% were Jewish, and 33% were atheists. And then if you look at our transgender, people said 21% of Americans are transgender. So when Donald Trump is talking about, the evil trans women are going to come in your daughter's bathroom, if you think there's 21% of Americans are transgender, like that's, this is behind the fear that these Republicans are using and leveraging. And, the problem is, though, you can't remove an idea from people's mind. All you can do is put another one in. You can't fact check your way out of fascism, but what you can do is teach people something different and something better.
Yeah, that's a really great way to put it. I mean, Democrats have to figure out who they're going to hate, frankly. Unfortunately, because of the ways in which the donor class works, Democrats are reluctant to engage in an overt class warfare. I mean, because ultimately, what you need is you do need an enemy, right? People respond to that. And it doesn't mean the enemy needs to be beaten or killed or have some violence placed on them, the kind of ways in which Republicans talk about. But you need to have somebody to target, frankly. I mean, FDR, again...
Well, you need to give him an explanation. That's what you need.
Yeah. Like, I mean, FDR was masterful about
who did this to you? Who did this?
FDR was perfect about this. It was the corporations. Even though FDR was a super rich guy who had tons of corporate people in his White House, right? Who was incredibly pro-monopoly, right? I mean, like FDR's actual policies.
The malefactors of great wealth.
Populism.
Yeah, was how he put it. Malefactors of great wealth, and that was a phrase he used over and over in variations of that, and it worked. And Republicans basically have, to go back to what I was saying, they've created the enemy now, which is the deep state. And of course, the deep state, they never define what that is or what that even means or who's in it or what it does. They don't have to do any of that stuff. Yep. All they tell people is there's this, group of people that are highly educated, that are non-religious, and they like gay and trans people, and they're out to get you. Yeah. And we're going to stop them from hurting you. Yeah. And it's laughable and it's offensive, but it's effective.
Well, yeah, and again, Democrats have to figure out how to create effective messaging like that. I mean, to be honest, like how do you, and probably the target needs to be billionaires, right? I mean, like there are a group of people out there who are making your lives worse, right? These are billionaires. And Donald Trump is the epitome of that, right? Musk and all these other people who are bringing into the administration. The next 4 years are going to be billionaires ruling us in ways that are going to hurt a whole lot of people. How do you create the messaging to target those people as, in fact, evil, right? As malefactors, as FDR said. And that has to be a piece of it, right? Because, again, the core issue of organizing, and political campaigns are not organizing. It's not the same thing. And it's one of the problems the Democratic Party has is conflating those two things. But you have to, but the first rule of organizing is you have to meet people where they are at, not where you are at, where they are at. Democrats have lost that. We don't meet people where they're at. We assume a set of beliefs. And then if other people aren't part of that or whatever, or reject that, then they're stupid or they're racist or this kind of like these really broad claims that are being made about Trump voters. I mean, sure, some Trump voters are racist. I mean, yeah, tell me about it, right? But there's these masses of people who are disengaged, who are lightly engaged, who think Trump is funny, right? Whatever it may be, you have to be able to reach out to those people. You have to meet them where they are at. And if you're not doing that, then you're not engaging in politics.
You're not. And, in a democratic political system, there will be either economic populism or cultural populism. And if you don't understand that and you reject that, then you're going to lose. Like, it's just that simple. And Trump and Republicans have, there's this entire industry now just kind of bemoaning, oh, the Republicans vote against their self-interest. And they think that the government doesn't have their interest at all in mind. So they, their economic interest, they think the whole system is rigged. So that argument is meaningless to them. And so because they think that, and it's the same thing true on race, like there was this idea that caught on among a lot of Democrats that, well, demographics are destiny.
Yeah.
That is what they thought, that black people would always be Democrats, that Hispanic people would always be Democrats. And it's the exact same mistake that they made with blue-collar white people, because what made these people Democrats was a shared story, was institutions, was a communal memory of who fucked them over and how they stopped it.
Yeah. And it shouldn't have taken more than a cursory look at American history to know that these demographics as destiny line was not going to work out. Like, it's never worked out that way. Like, I'm sorry. Like this is what American history is for, is to provide us some lessons about what has worked and what has not worked in the past, right? About trends. History never repeats itself, right? It never say it to a historian, but there are trends in American culture, or trends in any nation's culture, that we can learn from and try to like make adjustments for. And that's certainly one of them. Like, demographics is never destiny. People aren't going to do what you tell them to do based on a particular set of characteristics that you're giving them. We all know those characteristics are malleable anyway, and we all know that, there's an entire field of whiteness studies that demonstrate that, like, what it means to be white changes all the time, and of course it's continuing to change, and bringing in all kinds of Latin Americans who are absolutely identifying with white power at this point. And so again, the way to manage that is to actually engage in actual populist politics and actually reach out and engage people on the ground where they're at, creating institutions, creating reasons for them to be Democrats, to be proud to be Democrats, to go in the streets as Democrats, and to believe the Democratic Party is actually going to work for them in a very, very real way, as opposed to this like, we're going to, we're going to engage in a slight change to the earned income tax credit, and that's really going to motivate voters. Like, what are you talking about? No, it's not.
No, it isn't. And and it has to, there's this temptation to think that, well, it's just this one thing, and if we just do this one thing different, then we would win. No, that's not how it works. Politics is about what you say, how you say it, what you do, and how you listen. And if you're not doing all those four things, then you're going to lose. It's that simple.
Yep. I couldn't agree more.
All right. Well, is there anything you feel like on the subject here that we need to hit on, or do you think we?
I think we've covered everything. We've covered. I mean, there's always more, but we've covered it pretty heavily. So I think this is if people are listening to 90 minutes of this, then or 80 minutes of this, then God bless them.
Well, hopefully they are. So, I thought it was a great discussion here. So for people who want to keep up with the stuff you're doing, tell us about your books and social media and websites.
Sure. So I have a few books. And the one that's probably the most well known is called The History of America in 10 Strikes. Came out with the New Press back in 2018. I have a new book coming out this spring called Organizing America, 20 Stories from Our Radical Past, that the New Press is also publishing. That'll be 20 short biographies of Americans who made change, which I think is really valuable right now in an era where so many liberals feel hopeless. I'm also very active. I was on Twitter or X like everybody else, but I have made that switch to Blue Sky, and it's Erik Loomis at bluesky.social. And you can follow me there. I have daily labor history threads, and I write almost every day at the website Lawyers, Guns, and Money.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, I think that book, as you said, is going to be a really important one. So I encourage everybody to check that out. All right, thanks for being here, Eric.
Yeah, you bet. Hey, thank you so much for having me.
All right, so that is the program for today. I appreciate everybody joining us for the discussion. And you can always get more if you go to theoryofchange.show with the video, audio, and transcript of all the episodes. And my thanks especially to everybody who is a paid subscribing member of the show. You are making this possible. Thank you very much for your support. And if you can't afford to subscribe on Patreon or on Substack right now, we do have free options as well if you want to keep tabs on the show that way. And I encourage everybody to visit flux.community as well. Thanks very much for your support, and I'll see you next time.